What happens when your behavior finally catches up with you? Because over the past few weeks, something has clearly shifted when it comes to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. This hasn't been one isolated headline or one negative story that can be easily dismissed. Instead, we've seen a series of reports, excerpts, and industry commentary, all emerging at the same time, all pointing in one similar direction, and all raising increasingly serious questions about their behavior, their working relationships, and how they are now being perceived behind the scenes. And if those reports and excerpts are to be believed, what they suggest is not particularly flattering. In fact, I would argue it's dire, because what we are now seeing is not just criticism of output or questions around projects, but something much more personal, a growing narrative that their behavior, both publicly and privately, may finally be catching up with them. Now, of course, both Meghan and Harry have strongly pushed back against some of these claims, even going as far as to describe certain reporting as deranged conspiracy. But what's equally notable is what hasn't happened. There have been no lawsuits filed against Variety. There has been no legal action taken against Tom Bower. And for a couple that has historically been very willing to take legal action when they feel misrepresented, that absence stands out. Because for me, as someone looking at this from the outside, it raises a very simple question. If claims like this were entirely false, entirely defamatory, and entirely damaging, then why allow them to circulate unchecked? And while that's something each person will interpret differently, my own view is this: when serious allegations are made, repeated, and published at this level, and no legal action follows, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss them outright. So in this video, I want to take a step back and look at everything that has happened over the past few weeks, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a much wider pattern. Because when you line all of this up, from Netflix stepping back, to some controversy around the Australia visit, to the release of book excerpts, to growing scrutiny from within the industry according to Variety, it starts to look less like coincidence and conspiracy, and more like a shift. And the question is no longer whether things are changing, it's how far that change is going to go. So to understand why this moment feels different, we need to start with what is actually being said right now, because this is no longer one issue, it's a pattern emerging in real time. So to begin with, we need to look at what has happened with Netflix, because this is one of the clearest and most immediate developments. Over the past couple of weeks, it was announced that Netflix will be stepping back from Meghan's lifestyle brand as ever, and would no longer be investing in it. And that is significant, because this wasn't just a minor project. Over the past year, that brand had become central to what Meghan Markle was doing professionally, particularly as the focus seemed to move away from their original idea of building a traditional production company and towards something much more focused on Meghan. And more commercially driven. So for Netflix to step away from that is not a small shift, not after Meghan telling us this.
Then Netflix came on not just as my partner in the show, but as my partner in my business, which was huge.
It's a very clear signal that something hasn't worked in the way it was intended. Now, I actually made a video a few days ago where I talked about what I see as a recurring pattern in how Meghan handles professional conflicts. And that pattern, in my view, is that situations rarely seem to end with grace. They tend to end with some form of grievance. And in many ways, this situation appears to follow the same pattern, because Netflix released what was, on the surface, a very generous and complimentary statement about Meghan, praising her and the work that had been done. But almost immediately after that, through sources, we start to hear a very different narrative from Meghan's side, that Netflix had been holding her back, they had been too cautious, and she wanted to go global. And this is where the tone becomes important, because instead of what could have been a straightforward moment, a simple acknowledgement, a clean transition, it instead begins to sound like a subtle criticism of the very company she had been working with. And that shift in tone is difficult to ignore, because what could have been a simple thank you, it begins to feel to some like a parting dig, and that in turn feeds directly into a narrative that we have heard repeatedly, and we continue to hear through these major outlets, these reputable outlets, that working relationships often become strained and that exits are rarely neutral. And at a certain point, that stops looking like conspiracy. This is where I want to bring in something that becomes even more important when we look at the Variety article later on. Because in that article, it is suggested that both Ted Sarandos and Bella Bajaria were behind the scenes becoming increasingly tired and frustrated. And yet, publicly, the tone is very different. Bajaria is quoted as saying, "Artwell has been a thoughtful and collaborative partner, and we've really enjoyed working with Harry and Meghan. They're deeply engaged in the storytelling process and bring a unique global perspective that aligns with the kinds of impactful projects our members respond to." Now, on the surface, that sounds entirely positive, but when you place it along what has actually happened, Netflix stepping back, Netflix downgrading the deal, Netflix no longer investing in as ever, there is a clear disconnect between what she has said in that statement and the actions of Netflix. And normally, the actions reveal all, not the words. And that goes for every situation, not just with Netflix, but the actions are not aligning with the language. And that raises an important question. If the relationship was so strong and successful and that the members really engaged and loved this kind of content, then why the shift in the deal? Why downgrade it? Why the shift in investment? Why the change in direction? This is where interpretation comes in, because one way of reading that is that these public statements are to some extent strategic, designed to maintain relationships, to avoid unnecessary conflict, and to keep future options open. Because in an industry like this, it is rarely beneficial to close the doors completely. And I would argue that's a lesson that Meghan hasn't quite learned. But Netflix seems to be aware that maybe there might be a project in the future with them. And according to Vanity Fair, in an article published in January 2025, they made allegations that Meghan was shopping around a divorce book. And the implication was that it would be from Harry. It wasn't about her last divorce, it would be from Prince Harry. Now, even though that's allegations, and this is just speculation on my part, it is possible that Netflix is aware that there might be money in the future, particularly if Meghan ever did a tell-all about her marriage to Harry. Again, that's just speculation, but it's one of the reasons that they might be keeping the door open and giving these positive responses, even though their actions are telling a very different story in the fact that they've essentially dropped them. So what we may be seeing here are two things happening at once. On one level, the public narrative remains polite, measured, complimentary, and on another level, a private reality that appears to be moving in a very different direction. And when those two things begin to diverge, it usually tells you something important. And then almost immediately after that, we see another situation begin to unfold. The announcement of an upcoming visit to Australia.
That's a lovely accent you have. New Jersey?
Austria.
Austria? Well then, g'day, mate. Let's put another shrimp on the barbie.
Now on paper, that should be straightforward. A public appearance, an opportunity to maybe reconnect with an audience that they feel they have there. Whether that's true or not, Australians, you'd have to tell me. There are already questions being raised. Just in the last few days, there have been reports of expensive ticket pricing surrounding associated events. There are also claims that one of the organizers connected to the visit may be facing financial issues, including alleged debts owed to the Australian government in taxes. And while these are still reports and should be treated as such, their timing is notable because they begin to add another layer of uncertainty to what should have been a relatively simple engagement. And at the same time, there are suggestions that Meghan herself has been unsettled by leaked emails, reportedly losing sleep over the whole Australian situation. And again, taken on its own, that might not seem especially significant, but placed within this wider context, definitely contributes, from my perspective, to a sense of instability. And alongside all of this, we are starting to see broader comparisons being made. Comparisons between Meghan and Harry and figures like Sarah Ferguson and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, particularly when it comes to the commercialization of status and the use of connections to create opportunities. And that comparison is telling, because it suggests that the perception is shifting away from something new or disruptive and towards something that people feel they have seen before. And once that comparison starts to take hold, it can be very difficult to move away from it. And then on top of all of this, you have the timing of Tom Power's book, Betrayal, because those excerpts are being released just ahead of the visit, and the book itself will be released just before their visit, which means that any negative press, any criticism, any narrative that is currently building is unlikely to stay contained. I believe it will follow them. So let's move into what is arguably the most significant escalation so far, or at least one of them, which is the release of excerpts from Tom Bower's new book. Of course, variety is obviously a significant escalation as well, but we will be getting onto that later on in the video. But let's start with the excerpts, because this is where the tone began to shift from questions to direct and highly detailed allegations. These excerpts, published in the Times, outline a series of claims about Meghan and Harry's relationship with the royal family, their behaviour behind the scenes, and how they have conducted themselves since stepping back from royal duties. And the scale of what is being alleged here is important, because this isn't one claim or one isolated criticism. It is multiple allegations across different situations, all contributing to a very specific picture. And when that many claims are presented at once through such credible sources, like Tom Bower, he is a barrister, it becomes much harder to dismiss them individually. The reason I mention that he's a barrister is that he's aware, I believe, of his legal framework, of what he can use and what he can't, of the sources that are credible and the ones that are not. So the allegations made in this book, to me, are credible. Now, for anyone who's been following Meghan and Harry closely, the whole saga over the years, and who has read these excerpts, a lot of this will already feel familiar. They're not entirely new ideas. There's definitely new information, but the ideas, the situations, many of us are familiar. We've heard elements of this before in reporting, in previous books, in interviews from other content creators, in public perception. But what feels different here is the way it's all being brought together, because rather than isolated claims or fragments of a narrative, what this starts to look like is something more complete with more detail, and him having spoken to sources on the ground. It's almost like the final piece of a puzzle being put into place. And that matters, because when separate details begin to align, when different accounts start to reinforce each other, the focus shifts, not just among people who've been following this saga, but I would argue on a more mainstream level. It's no longer about whether each individual claim stands on its own. It's about what they suggest when they're viewed together. And this is really important later on in the video, because we will be going back to look at something important. So bear in mind that we're seeing this pattern, and it's not just people following this saga, it's also now, according to Variety article, mainstream outlets. So this is where we get the narrative really starting to solidify. Now, among the most striking claims are those relating to Harry's relationship with the royal family. Of course, these are my opinions. I do encourage you to read the excerpts and make your own opinions. These are the most striking claims according to moi. According to Bower, there were concerns from within the royal family that Harry's behavior had significantly changed, with even Queen Camilla allegedly describing him as being brainwashed. There were also accounts of early tensions between Meghan and other senior royals, including a reported confrontation with Prince William during a meeting that was intended to ease tensions, but instead escalated them. If you don't mind, get your finger out of my face. And then we move to more recent events. One of the most widely discussed sections focused on Meghan and Harry's visit to the victims of the LA fires. From their perspective, they wanted it presented obviously as something charitable and supportive. Many content creators, many independent reporters had said at the time that they believed this was a publicity stunt. And the reason is, many celebrities had gone down to the LA fires to help out. How many of them ended up right in front of a camera, had pictures taken of them walking around the ruins and ashes of people's homes that the owners couldn't even get to? How many of them were seen hugging chefs, and I believe it's the mayor, and I think even Meghan was hugging her assistant, allegedly. The woman to her left, I think, was someone on payroll. I don't know if that was a victim of the fires, so that's not very clear to me. My point is, Bower in this book only goes to essentially back up the claim that it was indeed a publicity stunt. According to him, the couple was spooked after hearing John Mulaney make a joke about them, and their publicist allegedly told them, okay, go down, do something positive, and they chose the LA fires.
John Mulaney is not holding back. He brutally dragged Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's failed Netflix projects in front of A-listers such as Ben Affleck and Tina Fey. John, whose Netflix live show will premiere on March 12th, gushed over the platform for giving him a shot, adding, quote, "This is a really fun experiment. Not since Harry and Meghan has Netflix given more money to someone without a specific plan."
Bauer claims that footage of Meghan interacting with victims was quickly distributed by publicists, and instead of being received positively, it triggered backlash. And I remember this myself. We had backlash coming from TMZ and from many other sources. We had critics going as far as to describe them as disaster tourists. And once that kind of language enters the public conversation, it tends to linger.
Late Friday, we got some images that turned into a big controversy this weekend. The images were of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle with the mayor of Pasadena walking through some of the rubble, the ruins, what was Altadena.
I found it crazy that there are people, most people cannot get into these areas, especially Altadena, and they don't even know if their homes are still there because they're not letting people in. For Meghan and Harry to show up from Montecito, where they don't have a home there, and they're the ones that get in and they get a tour, for what reason? For what purpose? What are they going to do?
Agreed. It does seem like ill use of resources.
It's not sitting well with people in the community. There is no business for them to look at the destruction.
And then there is the section on Invictus, which is particularly significant because this has always been one of Harry's most respected and widely supported projects. But in these excerpts, it is framed in a very different way. There are claims that Meghan used the games as a platform for herself, that organizers found them difficult to work with, which only goes to echo what many other businesses and reports and even palace staff have claimed.
Well, hello, you.
And that internal concerns were raised about the event becoming the Harry and Meghan show. There are even suggestions of declining attendance and carefully managed optics, which including what is described as crowd padding, essentially where people were brought in, that they were specifically put around Meghan and Harry, especially for photos and cameras, but allegedly the rest of the stadium was quite empty. Now, whether all of these claims are accurate or not, and I believe they are, it's something that people will have to ultimately decide for themselves. But what matters here is that they are now being said openly and in a widely published book and are being repeated across mainstream coverage. And yes, the book comes out on the 26th of March, but these excerpts have been published across almost all media, and that changes the nature of the conversation entirely because this is coming from someone incredibly credible. And almost immediately after these excerpts were released, Harry and Meghan responded, and through a spokesperson, they dismissed Bauer's work as deranged conspiracy and melodrama and criticized his credibility as an author, which is again a very strong reaction. And I actually have to thank Meghan and Harry because it's through their statement that I remembered to order the book. I had planned to when I heard about the release of this book, but it had slipped my mind in recent months. And if it were not for their public statement, I probably wouldn't have ordered the book until around the release time or just after. So thank you, Meghan and Harry. You ended up publicizing the book for Tom Bauer. And what makes this situation particularly interesting is what followed, because just in the last few hours, Tom Bauer has since responded himself. Bauer told The Express, "The Variety article endorses what I described in my book, Betrayal. The Sussexes are reaching the end of the road in Hollywood. Their behavior, lack of original talent, and suffocating self-importance has made it even more important for them to return to Britain in July, meet the King, and be revalidated as royals." And he went even further, adding, "That option, I believe, will be denied to them. They face an increasingly tough future. That's the price of betraying the royal family since Megxit." Now, that is obviously a very blunt assessment, but I agree with him. And I know people will make up their own minds about how fair it is. But what matters here is that Bauer is not backing away from what he has written. If anything, he seems to be doubling down and doing so by arguing that subsequent reporting is only reinforcing his central argument. And so when separate sources begin to align, it strengthens the perception that there seems to be some bad behavior at play. And this is why this book matters. Not necessarily because every single claim in it will be new, but it's because it's pulling it all together. And I do believe he has left some bombshells for this book, because excerpts being released will never give you the real juice. They're just there to give you a little bit of flavor. So I'm really excited for this book. And like I said, I will be doing a full review on this channel, chapter by chapter. So if you're interested, this will be the place for you to join. At this point in the video, I think it's really important to step back and look at what all of this actually means, because this isn't just about recent headlines or even about the past few weeks. This is about something much broader. It's about the long-term effects of behavior and what happens when that behavior starts to catch up with you, whether it's the perceived self-indulgence or the idea that it looks like many of their charitable work are actually photo ops. It seems that now it's really coming to a head. And to understand this properly, we also need to go briefly back to the beginning, because the first major public rupture came obviously with the Oprah Winfrey interview with Meghan and Harry. And that was the moment when everything was aired publicly and on a global platform with horrendous accusations that were unfounded and then later kind of backtracked and reframed. And at a time for many people, that was their first real exposure of any of these issues. So naturally, a lot of people took what they said at face value. They accepted the claims or they accepted the framing because there wasn't at that point a wider known pattern to compare it to. But what's interesting now is how that moment looks in hindsight, because when you take what we've just gone through, Netflix, even Spotify, I know we haven't talked about it, but I'm sure everyone's aware of that situation, the Australian situation, the book excerpts, and in a moment we'll get to the Variety article. When you place all those things alongside the original interview, a different picture begins to emerge, because the behavior we're seeing now doesn't appear suddenly. It actually appears consistent right from the beginning. That is the consistent we have throughout all these conflicts. The common denominator seems to me to be Harry and Meghan. And this is where the focus starts to shift, because at the time, the royal family took the majority of the blame. That was the dominant narrative. But what we've seen since then is a series of professional and personal relationships across different industries, different continents, different projects, different contexts that have also ended in tension, difficulty, or breakdown. Spotify, Netflix, public appearances, industry relationships, and allegedly friendships as well. And yet in each of these situations, the explanation tends to follow a similar pattern. The issue is not with Harry and Meghan. It was the institution, or it was that company, or they were holding us back. We mutually decided to part ways. It was the environment. I'm embarrassed by Jessica, but I have never heard Meghan and Harry release a statement where they've taken accountability. Not once. And that is very telling, because when the same outcome keeps repeating, the same stories of alleged bad behavior and alleged bullying keeps coming out again and again, year after year, we have to ask, what is the common denominator? And this is where, based on the reporting we've seen, particularly in the Variety article, the focus increasingly turns towards Meghan Markle. Yes, Harry is not innocent at all, but one cannot ignore that through The Hollywood Reporter, The Daily Beast, Vanity Fair, and now Variety, we seem to be hearing allegations about Meghan's bad behavior, Meghan's poor communication skills. And even though Harry is no saint, he has a lot of problems. One thing that we keep hearing consistently is the bullying allegations are coming from Meghan's alleged behavior. This has become more frequent and in much more detail. The distinction matters because while both Meghan and Harry are part of this dynamic, and I cannot state this strongly enough, Harry, in my opinion, is just as bad as Meghan for the situation they have created. That is my opinion. The volume and consistency of reporting around Meghan's behavior, her working style, her interactions with others appears to be more pronounced. That's all I'm saying. And that brings us directly into the Variety article, because after everything we've just gone through, this is where it all comes together. The article doesn't just add another layer of criticism. It brings that criticism directly inside the industry itself. And once it reaches that level, it becomes much harder to dismiss. Right from the opening, the tone is clear. They describe 5.5 years at Netflix as tumultuous. They talk about Archewell struggling to release bingeable content, and they point out that what was supposed to be a full-scale production company has, over the past 18 months, effectively turned into a vehicle for Meghan and her lifestyle brand. And that alone tells you everything has shifted, because this was supposed to be about building an entertainment empire, and instead it's being framed as something much smaller, much more limited, much more self-focused, and ultimately much less successful than originally promised. That's not just a slowdown, that's a reset of expectations. And then we get into what is probably the most important theme in the entire article, which is that Netflix is simply tired. The article says that the Sussexes have been selling repackaged versions of the same story, and that this has exhausted Netflix. And that is a very direct way of saying that the one thing that made them valuable in the first place is no longer working. And once a narrative stops working, it stops selling. So they're not valuable anymore. And that's a huge shift, because for years the narrative has been that Meghan in particular has strong relationships within the industry, that she has access, that she has influence. But this article presents a very different picture. It suggests that insiders believe figures like Ted Sarandos are fed up, and that Bella Bajaria has grown weary. And even though there are official denials, which I went through at the beginning of this video, the overall tone is clear. There is frustration at the highest level, and frustration at that level rarely disappears quietly. So what you end up with is a contradiction. On one side, the public narrative of closeness and influence, and on the other side, insiders suggesting that the relationship is strained and possibly coming to an end. And that contradiction is important, because it suggests that what has been presented publicly does not fully reflect what is happening behind the scenes. We have two contradictions here. And when that gap really opens up, trust tends to follow. I'm talking about trust in the industry. I think Hollywood is done with Meghan and Harry. And then we move into what now has become a consistent theme, in my opinion: problems working with Meghan. The article talks about bedside manner, ruffling feathers, poor communication, and tensions in meetings. And when you place that alongside everything we've seen discussed, it becomes very difficult to see this as a one-off issue, because this pattern keeps repeating. Different partnerships, different projects, but the same outcome: tension, frustration, and distance. And at a certain point, repetition becomes reputation. And then there are the more specific details. Claims that Meghan talks over Harry, recasts his points, and takes control of conversations in meetings. Claims that she would leave Zoom calls after taking offense to something that was said. Now, all of this is denied. Her denial, I do not believe. She blames it on her kids, that she's a working mom, but I imagine these Zoom meetings are not happening at night. I imagine they're happening during the day. She has said she has a nanny, so it's hard for me to believe that she's getting distracted by her kids when she has paid help to look after them in their mansion. It's not like they're living in an apartment and she has no nanny, so I don't believe her claim. That's just my opinion. The other thing I want to mention is that we have seen, all the way back from Harry and Meghan getting together to present day, body language, which to me reveals a very controlling nature. Let's put in a few honorable mentions of Meghan clearly directing the way, controlling the way, tapping people, pointing to where people should walk. Let's take a look. So the reason I've included those clips is because it aligns with what many people feel they have already observed publicly, and the article is backing this up. The idea of Meghan touching Harry's thigh or interrupting him, and in my opinion, showing little respect. If you're talking over someone, you are not respecting what they're saying. You don't respect their time, and you're not respecting their expression. That's just my personal opinion. The same with guiding people. I think it's a very controlling habit. I think it shows a very dominant person. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Nobody should be controlled in how they do things, to the point where there are a few clips where Meghan has tapped Harry before from behind, and you can see he's startled. He kind of jumps back. This is what happens when you try to control situations so much. And that's why when Meghan claims things like this, it's hard to believe.
About 5 years ago, when you and your husband left England and you descended on Montecito, California, and you planned what your next few years would look like in terms of the business impact you could have and the philanthropic impact you could have. And a lot of initiatives are going. But I want to just go back to that moment of, as you and your husband were planning this out, how did you think about what you wanted to do, what your ambitions could do, and from your seat, what you could do for women?
Well, I think 5 years ago was a very different situation for all of us.
A few moments later.
There was no plan.
This is somebody, according to Vanity Fair, who looks up a menu before going to a restaurant. And we can see her controlling body language. So to think that there was no plan, again, her actions and her words, to me, often don't align. And we just have the Variety article essentially reinforcing an existing perception. And once a perception is reinforced, it becomes much harder to challenge. Of course, Meghan and Harry are denying all these claims. They're denying what Tom Bauer has said. And the challenge that they give is the excuse of conspiracy, especially with Tom Bauer. It just shows that they continue to go with these things. Originally, they said against the bullying allegations from palace staff that it was a smear campaign. Now they're going with conspiracy theories. They don't seem to be willing to address individual claims, but it's just deranged conspiracy or a smear campaign. So when we step back and look at all of this, what you're really seeing is not just criticism of output. It is criticism of behavior, and that is our topic for today. It's the idea of behavior catching up with you. It's a criticism of their working style, of how relationships are managed. The Variety article is backing up all of these points. And in an industry like this, that matters just as much, if not more, than the content itself, because people will tolerate underperformance for a while, but they don't tolerate difficulty and underperformance. No one will accept those two negatives at the same time. There has to be some compensation. And that leads into the biggest shift of all, because they are no longer being seen as a major opportunity. They are being seen as a risk. And that is a fundamental change, because once you're seen as a risk, everything becomes harder, especially for a couple who clearly are out to make money. If they weren't, they wouldn't be doing the kind of things they're doing, or setting up the businesses they're setting up, or going to Australia, or speaking here and there, or doing events. Prince Harry did an event in Canada where he was supposed to be speaking about real estate, but there was a clip that was leaked, and he ended up talking about his mother. I'm just saying, the right place and the right time. I don't think a real estate event is the time to bring up that kind of personal family issue. I don't know how successful their events will actually be, these speaking events, if they don't know how to stay on track. And we've already seen from one of the excerpts from Tom Bauer that one of the organizers of an event was extremely upset with Meghan, because instead of using the script and the speech they had agreed on, Meghan mentioned herself an alleged 50 times, or the word I 50 times. I'm sure we all remembered the speech.
I'm so grateful to be in your company today. I was first invited to be a counselor at One Young World. I was probably a lot like each of you. How am I here? And there I was the girl from Suits. And I was surrounded by world leaders. I was so overwhelmed by this experience. I think I even saved my little paper place card, proof that I was there, I belonged. I was so nervous. I doubted myself, and I wondered if I was good enough to even be there, if what I was doing in the world, albeit important and meaningful as far as I saw it, was it deserving? One Young World saw in me, just as I see in you. My life had changed rather significantly. And I was now a mom. And I would ask, what is this world he would come to adopt? And what can we do? What can I do to make it better?
So my point is, this couple seems to be very self-serving, very self-involved, and tone-deaf. And so when you bring all of this together, we've got repeated tensions, breakdown of relationships, growing frustration within the industry, and them being called out. And it would seem to me that their bad behavior is finally catching up to them. So bringing this to an end, all I can say is what has become clear to me over the past few weeks is not just that things have been difficult recently for the couple, but that this moment didn't come out of nowhere. I believe it's the result of something that has been building over time, because patterns don't form overnight. They reveal themselves gradually through repetition, through consistency, and through the way similar situations continue to produce the same outcomes. And until Meghan and Harry look inside and really start to reflect, self-reflect, and change the things that are not working for them, I believe this downward trajectory will continue. At the end of 2025, I made a video saying that they had a disaster year, and I really didn't think things could get that much worse. But the events over the last few weeks have proven me wrong. When the same outcomes keep repeating across different people and different environments, the focus inevitably shifts from the situation to the behavior behind it. And that is where things now appear to be. What we're seeing is not just criticism, but alignment between reporting, industry sentiment, and public perception. And once those things come together, it becomes much harder to control the narrative, because the reality is simple. You can shape perception for a while, you can manage the narrative, but only for so long. Eventually, behavior catches up. And the question now is not whether things have shifted, it's how far that shift is going to go. And with the full release of Betrayal still to come, there is clearly more to unfold. So I'll be breaking that down here, chapter by chapter, as it comes out. If you're interested, join me March 26th for our first review of the first chapter and analysis. Because if this is the point where everything is starting to catch up, then what happens next is going to matter more than ever. That is it for today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you agree with me? Do you think this is their behavior catching up to them? Or do you have a different perspective? Let's open up the conversation below. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.